Hello, welcome back to the Fruit of Grisaia. After a stiff, formulaic goodbye to my grandparents, I dropped by my school for a few brief formalities, then began the journey home. Of course, I hadn't seen that home in many years. I had only the vaguest memories of the house itself. I was sincerely happy to be leaving my grandparents behind, but that didn't make me any less uncertain about the new life being thrust on me so abruptly. The car headed north at high speed, moving from the coastline into the outskirts of the metropolitan area. We were heading for the heart of West Tokyo.
あとどれぐらいで着くのですか?
An elderly man who had introduced himself as the chief of the clerical department at my father's company was behind the wheel.
車が混んでいなければ、あと30分もすれば着くかと存じます。
Glancing briefly at his GPS screen, he answered my question in a calm tone.
そうですか.
60 kilometers as the crow flies. That was the distance from my grandparents' house to that of my father. In the end, my mother had never managed to return to a place less than an hour away by car. And I myself was only coming back on someone else's power. I didn't have the slightest idea what was coming next. I wasn't particularly hopeful, but I didn't feel much in the way of despair either. It would be enough if I could just spend my days quietly until I finally became an adult. With that thought, I closed my eyes and waited for the car to arrive at its destination. Just as the chief secretary had told me, we reached my new home about 30 minutes later.
大きい.
The house was very different from the patchwork image I had sewn together from fragments of my childhood memories, far more magnificent than I remembered it. From the outside, the building itself looked like a Western-style mansion straight out of a manga. The spacious gardens were surrounded by a high wall. The grounds were covered in so many tall, beautiful trees that it could have been a park. I had hazy memories of those things, but after years in the country, their scale and magnificence took me by surprise. But on an emotional level, the sight left me cold. My father's actions were one thing. My obedient return at his house, whistle was another. No matter how splendid the house might have been, when I thought about the foundation it was built on, my thoughts naturally took a turn for the bitter.
お母さんと戻ってこられたら.
I whispered the words to myself, too softly for the driver taking my luggage from the trunk to hear. Passing through a finely wrought metal gate, I returned to the house I spent my first years in. The uninspiring luxury was all the more pronounced inside the house itself. As I took off my shoes and looked around the gleaming entrance hall, I heard footsteps approaching from a side passage.
Yumiko, 戻ったか? 大きくなったな.
It probably would have taken me some time to recognize the person standing in front of me, if not for the recent photograph I'd seen in a certain magazine 1 year before. Face to face with my father for the first time in what felt like decades, I saw a middle-aged man with a reasonably healthy complexion, but a subtle hint of something like gloom in his eyes.
ただいま戻りました.
As I lowered my head in a polite bow, my father continued in the same cheerful tone.
どうした? 声に元気がないじゃないか. 車に長い時間乗ったから疲れたのか?
I was more taken aback than anything else. Considering the way he had treated Mom and me up until that point, his aggressively friendly attitude was incomprehensible. From what I could remember, my father and I had only spoken a bare handful of times when I was a child, and certainly never like that. His motives weren't clear to me, but the sudden attempt at intimacy was off-putting. I didn't quite know how to respond to it.
大丈夫です。ちょっとお部屋に戻って休みます.
For the moment, I just wanted to cut the nauseating conversation short.
ああ、わかった。ユミコの好きなようにするといいよ。
失礼します。
With another bow to my father, I made my way past him, heading for the one part of the house I remembered well. My very first place of refuge, the bedroom in which I had spent so many hours as a young child. I climbed the stairs and found my room without the slightest hesitation. Remembering its location so exactly prompted a brief swell of nostalgic emotion, but that soon gave way to that recurring sense of disgust. My memories there weren't exactly happy in their own right. The room I entered for the first time in years was so completely changed that I couldn't help raising my voice in surprise. The badly mismatched desk and bed had been cleared away. In their place was a complete arrangement of fancy furniture and pretty little luxury items, exactly the sort of things that might appeal to a girl of my age.
わざわざ揃えたのかしら。
Every part of the decor seemed as if it could have come straight from the set of a movie. The room was filled with fragile, ephemeral things. It felt as though they'd disappear like soap bubbles if I actually touched them. Normally they would have made me happy, but at the moment it seemed like a hollow gesture.
お母さん、帰ってきたわよ。
Sitting on my bed, I murmured those words to myself. I'd finally managed to return to that house, but my mother wasn't with me. All I had there was a forced artificial welcome from the man who had broken her. Would I simply resume the same numb, miserable life in a different setting? Staring up at the ceiling, I could feel the familiar jet black sludge growing thick inside my chest. I fought down the crushing feelings of despair as best I could, closed my eyes, and fell asleep. The next day, my father had arranged beforehand for my transfer into an all-girls school some 20 minutes from the mansion by car. It was a very prestigious institution. I'd actually recognized the name. I felt badly out of place, uncomfortable with my new uniform in the beautiful school building.
ねえ、あの子が。そうよね。榊家の。
I could hear the whispers from all sides. Entering the classroom, I sat quietly at an open desk as far from the others as possible. There was an improvement in one regard. The talk about me wasn't particularly cruel or hostile.
訳ありなのよね。ええ、ちょっとお近づきには。
But essentially, I was treated just like before. My classmates interacted with me in a business-like way when necessary, and otherwise largely pretended I wasn't there. A school full of young ladies from upper-crust families was surprisingly uncomfortable in its own way.
いい天気。
Having completed my formulaic introduction in the first day of classes, I found myself instinctively heading for the rooftop. After gazing up for a moment, I settled down against a concrete support near the edge of the roof and took out my sketchbook. I began to draw the sky above me. A simple pencil hatching, rendering the clouds and sky in shades of gray. That afternoon, I couldn't stand to look at the world. Anything my eyes settled on repulsed me. That empty sky was the only thing I could bring myself to observe calmly. The driver held open the front door to the house for me. I was delivered to school and back. I didn't even have to open my own doors anymore. That extreme courtesy only intensified my discomfort.
お帰りなさいませ。
The household employees greeted me with smiles so soft and mild it was slightly nauseating. When I answered with a brief nod, they began to bombard me with words in rapid succession, their tone eager and openly professional.
由美子様、何か召し上がりますか？いえ、 結構です。部屋へ戻ります。
では何かお飲み物をお持ちしましょうか。
それも結構です。喉は渇いておりませんから。
それでは何かありましたらお申し付けください。
はい。
Climbing slowly up the stairs, I heaved a heavy sigh. Would they be putting on that sort of show every single day from now on? Their deference was so transparently artificial that it was painful rather than flattering. Given my current position, it just might be possible to order them to stop acting like that. But I didn't know what repercussions that would have, especially if they were to report it to my father. I ended up deciding it best not to make waves at such an early stage. I had been able to postpone it for one day with excuses about my fatigue, but the time had come.
久しぶりだね。こうしてユミコと食事をとるのは。
A glass of wine in one hand, my father turned a radiant smile on me.
はい。
Inside my head, I spat out the words, "It's the first time." From the moment I sat down in front of that luxurious dinner and my beaming father, I was immediately filled with a desperate longing to flee. I tried a little of the sauteed duck on my plate just to kill a few seconds, but it seemed strangely tasteless and without texture.
学園の先生から褒められたよ。転入する際の成績が抜群だったとね。これなら学校間のレベル差はほとんど関係ないとのことだった。
My father, still maintaining the same cheerful tone as the night before, complimented me at great length.
はい。
All I could manage was to nod and mechanically shovel the food placed in front of me into my mouth. Course after course, and I couldn't taste a thing. Had they even put any salt on these, it was like eating hunks of rubber. Carrying things to my mouth solely for the sake of chewing on them didn't make for a pleasant dining experience. Gradually, I began to ignore my plate in favor of frequent sips of water.
気持ち悪い。
The tasteless food, Dad's barrage of praise, and myself sitting there passively just accepting it all. Everything about the scene made me sick. My emotions only grew darker with every passing minute. This was all some bizarre whim of my father's, that or a meaningless ceremony he was carrying out in pursuit of some hidden objective. What else could it possibly be?
ユミコ、髪はずっと伸ばしているのか？
I felt my breath catch in my throat. That summer day, the day when the heat had poured down on me like a rain of molten iron. The moment when I had clawed at my chest and hacked at my own hair in a spasm of self-loathing, it all came flooding vividly back.
はい。
I almost told him that I cut it short once. But what would be the point of explaining that to this man? It would only throw this little play into chaos. What on earth did my father mean by asking me a question like that? Why bring up the very thing that had always marked me as worthless?
そうか。とてもよく似合ってるよ。
My father, a smile on his face, spoke those words in a casual tone of voice.
ユミコ、
すみません。
Rising from my seat, I ran out of the room, both hands pressed tightly across my mouth.
おい、何か体に合わないものがあったんじゃないのか？
I could hear my father snarling at someone behind me, but I didn't have time to be worrying about that. Acid burned my mouth as I vomited the tasteless food out into the toilet bowl. None of it had the slightest flavor going down, but coming back up it was powerfully unpleasant. It seemed a bit unfair somehow.
何を勝手なこと。
Wasn't my sex the entire reason he cast Mom aside? What on earth was my father thinking? How could he say that? Why? He'd never even looked at me before. This had to be some kind of whim. He decided to play house for a while to appease his guilty conscience. Either that, or he needed to do so for some work-related reason.
このひどい。
How long would it take before I could find a safe haven? This was no better than living with my grandparents. No, in the countryside. At least I wasn't expected to do anything. There were expectations of me here. That made it even more agonizing.
何もしたくないのに。
Tasting the acid rising once more from the depths of my throat, I descended into self-pity. I would truly have preferred to shut myself up in a dark shed, to reject the world and do nothing at all for the rest of my life. But so long as I needed food to eat and a bed to sleep in, I had no choice but to play along with my father's momentary kindness. The thought triggered a new wave of nausea. One week passed. People often say that time flies when you're having fun, because it's true, because those first 7 days seem to last a century. Hanging my bag next to my desk, I pulled out my notes and textbooks. I was as isolated and out of place as ever in my new school. I'd been studying a good deal, but that was simply my way of killing the vast stretches of otherwise painfully empty time I spent there. It certainly had absolutely nothing to do with my father's praise. I hadn't sketched for a few days now. For one thing, the weather had been dull and gray, so I couldn't look up without remembering that day, and I just hadn't been in the mood in the first place. Even if I opened my sketchbook today, I'd only end up with another drawing of the sky, as if I didn't have enough of those already. Those vaguely self-mocking thoughts stopped me on the way up to the roof, redirecting my path down to the lower floor. My life was a steady line from one meaningless moment to the next. Identical days trickled by, but there was one thing that had begun to change in the course of that week. Human beings are frighteningly adaptable creatures. The meals with my father that had at first repulsed me to the point of vomiting were gradually growing tolerable. Sometimes I hated myself for that. But little by little, I was coming to understand that it wasn't just the result of my mind acclimatizing itself to the situation.
Yumiko, 学校には慣れたか？
はい。
いきなりの転校で戸惑ったかもしれんが、すぐに友達もできる。お父さんの時もだな。
My father was making a genuine effort. With gentle advice and anecdotes about his own experiences, he tried to reassure me. Apparently, Dad had gone through many transfers in his student years, and always struggled with how to present himself to his new classmates. Dad. I was beginning to learn a number of surprisingly personal things about my father as he persistently tried to draw me into conversation.
ああ、そうか。今は時代も違うだろうからな。すまなかったな、ユミコ。
いいえ。
And he wasn't pushy or arrogant about it. He always seemed to be considering my point of view. Just as I'd heard, Dad was on an extremely tight schedule. Even when he returned home, it was extremely rare for him to stay overnight. More frequently, he would return to his company immediately after dinner. But that also meant he was coming home solely to share a meal with me. I gradually grew less prickly and slightly more communicative. By now, I could eat dinner with him without a hint of queasiness.
どうしたユミコ？
いえ、なんでも。
Just as something was about to spill out of my mouth, Mom's pale, empty face had flashed before my eyes. I silently reminded myself, this man is responsible for my mother's suffering. That fundamental resentment hadn't faded. I wouldn't let it fade. Lying in bed in my darkened room, I thought things over. I was no less uncertain than when I first arrived at that place, but the reasons for that inner turmoil were beginning to change. My father's attitude toward me was becoming harder to process. At first, I'd simply been disgusted by his overfamiliarity. But by that point, it was harder to dismiss as some bizarre game. Sometimes I could almost take his friendliness at face value. Even that remark about my hair might have been intended as nothing more than a casual compliment. Such positive interpretations were beginning to seem plausible.
そんなの今更よ。
I tried mumbling negative words to myself, but the nagging doubts remained. My distant mother had grown kind when her condition improved. The situation was clearly different, but there was always the possibility my father had undergone a similar change in the years since I'd seen him last. Tossing and turning in my bed, I turned the questions over in my mind. I'd been so cold for so long, but little by little, I could feel something like warmth returning to my body. I'll just end up being betrayed again. This time will be different. With two opposing answers battling indecisively in my mind, I waited for dawn to come. Two months after my return to Tokyo, my life was beginning to change even outside of the house. School didn't seem particularly unpleasant anymore. It wasn't so difficult being alone in that place once you got used to it. So long as I quietly attended my classes, the entire day would pass easily enough. I never disliked studying, so once my mood took a turn for the better, it didn't feel like wasted time. The change in the seasons had brought more periods of clear weather. I'd resumed my habit of drawing on a daily basis. And as my mind grew calm, my art slowly began to change as well. My perspective, pointed straight up for so long, began to creep downward. Every once in a while, I'd include a townscape or two among my sketches. It wasn't exactly principled of me to be finding enjoyment in that life, but there was no point sulking forever. My sardonic feelings of self-reproach slowly faded. I began to look at the world around me more calmly. Jeez.
お帰りなさいませ。
ただいま。
Even those brutally awkward interactions with the household employees had gotten more tolerable with the passage of time. After a few weeks, they picked up on my non-reactions and began to tone down their aggressive approach. They would generally back off after letting me know they were available if I needed them. That arrangement was much more comfortable for me. By then, I actually was asking them for something every once in a while.
今日は部屋へすぐ戻られますか？ええ、そのようにします。かしこまりました。
After asking the maid to have someone call me when it was time for dinner, I returned to my room. Sitting down in front of my desk, I thought back over the last few months. My attitudes toward that new life were beginning to soften in many ways. The one exception, I was stubbornly continuing to keep my father at arm's length. His behavior hadn't changed. He continued to treat me kindly all the while. Nonetheless, I offered him nothing but brief monosyllabic answers, vaguely avoiding his questions. That had seemed only natural at first. What else could he expect after how he treated my mother? After abandoning me for years, that resentment seemed to justify my behavior. But months had passed, and I just couldn't see any sign of the cruel man I thought he was, at least not when he was interacting with me. Nearly every night, I rejected his gentle attempts to draw me into conversation. My father didn't seem to be letting that bother him, but I was beginning to feel increasingly guilty about my attitude.
どうしたらいいのかしら。
I threw the question up at my ceiling, knowing all too well that no answer would be forthcoming. It would be time for dinner soon. For a very different reason than before, I'd started to find that somewhat painful.
今日も由美子の話題が出てな。榊さんのお嬢さんは可愛くて聡明でいらっしゃると目黒医大の先生もおっしゃってたよ。
はい。
由美子がこんなにいい子に育って父さんも嬉しいよ、本当に。
This man had interacted with me as something close to an ideal father for 2 straight months. That day, as always, all that came out of his mouth were words of praise and concern for me. Uneasy feelings smoldered away quietly inside my chest.
なあ、由美子。
My father spoke to me in a kind tone of voice. I couldn't endure his gaze. I found myself hanging my head.
由美子。
I didn't dislike being praised, not at all. He was making time in an extremely busy life for me. I wasn't yet cynical enough to dismiss that. Sometimes I felt myself on the verge of being grateful.
ごめんなさい。
But no, not yet. That black grime was still inside me. There was always that other emotion struggling against my guilt. So long as that remained, I would never allow myself to get any closer to my father.
母さんのことか。
I felt myself twitch with surprise. Until that point, I had deliberately steered clear of that particular topic. I'd assumed my father was intentionally avoiding it as well, so the turn of the conversation came as a real shock.
話して良いものかずっと迷っていたが、ちゃんと話さないと由美子も納得してはくれないということなんだろうな。
そんな。私は。
いいんだ。これは父さんが悪かったんだ。
My father slowly began to speak. He spoke about his feelings toward my mother, how it felt when she left, and behind everything, the constant stress his incredibly demanding job had placed on their marriage. Everything my father told me turned my image of him completely on its head.
二人が出て行った時、本当に辛かったよ。連れ戻しに行こうって何度も思った。でも仕事に追われてそれができなかった。
In time, my increasingly isolated father began to seek comfort. He admitted that the affair described in the magazine article had happened at that time.
父さんも寂しかったんだ。会社でもいろいろとあっていけないことと知りつつも母さんを裏切るような雑誌に記事が出たと聞いたとき、一番に考えたのは母さんを巻き込んではいけないということだったんだ。それで弁護士を向かわせたんだが。
It was consistent that actions that had seemed so inhumanely cruel at the time could also be explained by my father's story. After all, that lawyer had never got the chance to speak with my mother. There was no proof he'd sent to serve her with divorce papers. But even so,
由美子。
my father looked straight at my face from across the table. I couldn't help myself. I returned his gaze. At some point, I'd forgotten to even to avert my eyes.
お父さんを許してくれないか。
It was a gentle voice. I'd begun to think I would never hear a voice like that ever again from anyone. And yet it was coming to me from him, the person whose acceptance, in a way, I'd always wanted most.
私。 私
Many thoughts flooded into my head in a confused jumble. Those words were more than powerful enough. My fragile defensive wall had finally sprung a leak.
ごめんなさい。
ユミコ。
ごめんなさい、お父さん。ちょっと私
I stood from my chair, turned away from that concerned face, and hurried out to the hallway. I feel really bad for this family. Halfway covering my face with my right hand, I stumbled up the stairs as best as I could. On the way up, I caught a glimpse of a servant staring at me in shock, but I wasn't composed enough to pay that any mind. The world was growing hazy before I even reached my floor. In an instant, I closed the door to my room behind me. The tears came pouring down my face. One drop stained the ivory carpet beneath my feet, then another.
お父さんあんなこと
It was hard to understand. I couldn't reconcile the man with the vicious, older person the magazines described. There were so many things about him that confused me. But I couldn't believe he'd spoken those words for show. It sounded as if they'd come from the heart. Just as Mom had come to regret the cruel things she said to me, perhaps Dad was simply trying to make up for his mistakes. Looking at it from that angle, it wouldn't be so hard to accept his apology.
いいのかなねお母さん
I had one photograph of my mother left, safe in the memory of my mobile phone. But as always, her face was turned to the side. I couldn't read her expression.
今度こそ幸せになっても
My life had been shades of gray for so very long. Little by little, I could see colors beginning to emerge. It was a pleasant feeling. Oh. The air was still a little cold, but the sky that day was remarkably beautiful. Putting down my brush, I stretched out and muttered a few words to no one in particular.
今日はこのぐらいにしておこうかしら
Recently, I'd been getting so absorbed in my art that it was easy to forget the time. There had been a few incidents where I kept my car waiting long enough to cause some anxiety, so I started making a conscious effort to check my watch frequently. I examined my sketchbook. Instead of the sky that I'd been devoted to for so long, today I had painted the rooftop flower bed.
こんなのが描けるようになったのね
After months of obsessively sketching the clouds, the change had taken me by surprise. For a while, I just gazed down at that image, various emotions running through me.
いけない時間
I hurriedly gathered up my painting materials and pushed them into my bag. As it turned out, I was a little slow coming home after all. My life changed rapidly after my father's apology. The dinners together that had once been so painful were now something I looked forward to. I talked to him about many things. My art, formerly sketches of the sky in black pencil, had become increasingly colorful work executed with paintbrushes. Even my life at school was shifting ever so slightly for the better.
榊さん、今ちょっといいかしら。
飯田さんいいわよ
A girl who stood out even among the young ladies in our class, Iida Kanako, had begun to approach me on a regular basis.
ここがちょっとわからないんだけど、教えていただけるかしら。
古文の現代語訳ね確かにここは難しいわちょっと待ってて
We'd struck up a conversation about our work in art class one day, and had been talking like this pretty frequently ever since. She wasn't quite a friend yet. But up until then, I'd almost never had actual conversations in school with anyone but the teachers. By my standards, it was an enormous step forward.
ありがとう。榊さんの説明には無駄がなくていいわ。
私はただ普通に話しているだけよ。
そんなことないわよ。先生とか向いてるかもね。
A perfectly normal, unremarkable little scene. Remarkable little scene. But in comparison to the emptiness of my life before then, those moments made every day feel astonishingly fresh and new.
お父さん、お帰りなさい。
ああ、ただいま、ユミコ。
Dad was still an incredibly busy man. Nonetheless, he would always come home at least a few times every week to have dinner with me. I used to only see his face during the meal itself, but recently I'd started greeting him at the door with a natural smile on my face.
今日はね、飯田さんとずっとお話ししていて。
おお、前に言っていた友達のことだね。
まだ友達とかじゃないんだけど。
Previously, my father had talked and talked while I offered only brief responses, but the situation was largely reversed. I told Dad about everything, every trivial little thing in my life. No matter what the topic, he never failed to hear me out with a smile. That made me happy.
なあ、ユミコ。
どうしたの、お父さん。
美佐子が治ったら3人で海外旅行にでも行くか。忙しくてそういうことをしてあげられなかったからな。それとも何か別のことがいいか。
私、遊園地がいいな。
遊園地？そんなのいつだって行けるだろう。
そこがいいの。
My father looked mystified. Still, I stuck to my guns. When I was very small and very lonely, the idea of a family visit to an amusement park had enchanted me. I was well past the age to be begging for a trip like that, but that secret yearning had never really gone away.
そうか。わかった。父さんの会社の系列にも遊園地はあるからな。それこそ貸し切りで行こうか。
そんなのじゃなくていい。普通にでいいから。
ユミコはいつも控えめだな。
He doesn't have to go that far.
じゃあ美佐子が母さんが治ったら3人で遊園地に行くか。
Dad spoke those words with a smile. It was the first time I'd asked him for anything. Even as my days became happier, I had been careful not to say anything greedy, anything about the things I wanted. I suppose I couldn't quite believe that tranquil life was real. If I asked too much of the dream, I was afraid it might just fall apart underneath me.
今日は父さんとそんな話をした。
Ever since that day, the size of my diary entries had increased exponentially. Where I used to write, nothing happened again and again, ripping off the bottom of the page for scrap paper. Now I was often running out of space before I could cover everything. And in the center of my room, a canvas stood on an easel, surrounded by a colorful array of art supplies, all things I purchased and used frequently.
もう本当に大丈夫よね。
Will something happen again? Will it fall apart in the blink of an eye? Everything was so peaceful that at times it made me uneasy. Come to think of it, those few days before my mother was scheduled to leave the hospital, it felt very much the same.
最後出しておこうかな。
I hope this lasts forever. I'm quite sure I scribbled those words at the end of my diary entry. It was the one small wish I would allow myself. The rainy season had come and gone. Summer was fast approaching. It was a day like any other. Reading on the internet that the weather would be taking a turn for the worse in the afternoon, I called off my usual rooftop painting session and went home a little early.
ここで止めてもらっていいですか？
いいんですか？まだ少し歩きますが。
今日はちょっと歩きたい気分なので。
Yumiko's route is probably gonna be the most descriptive with a lot of the just random things. They said it would be raining in the evening, but for the moment it was a pleasant afternoon, well suited to a bit of light exercise. Therefore, I got out of the car halfway and walked the remaining kilometer or so home. This is gonna be overall the most descriptive route. There wasn't any real reason for that, it was just a whim. When I opened the front door and slipped inside, I found the entrance hall empty of the servants who were usually there to greet me.
誰もいない。
It was probably because I'd returned so suddenly. Even when I closed the door behind me, the hallway remained silent.
台所の方にでもいるのかしら。
Not that it really bothered me either way. I began to move toward the stairs.
ですのでそちらについても由美子様に気づかれないようにしています。
But a voice from deeper in the hallway stopped me in my tracks. If that woman hadn't happened to speak my name at that very moment, without a doubt I would have shrugged, gone up the stairs to my room, and stayed completely oblivious.
私のこと？
I slowly inched my way down the passage, careful not to make a sound, and stopped just before a corner. From the other side, I could hear the three employees who usually met me at the door talking about something.
今のところ問題なく進んでいるようだな。
はい、由美子様もすっかり旦那様に懐いているようです。
そうか、ならばいい。旦那様からは引き続き動向に注意しろと言われている。何かあったらすぐに報告するようにな。
わかりました。
They were speaking quietly, but I could make out their conversation clearly enough.
何のことを言っているの？
I shouldn't be listening to this. My throbbing heart was making that very clear. But my feet wouldn't budge, and my ears were intent on capturing every word of their discussion.
しかしこういう逆転劇もあるのね。びっくりしちゃった。
後継ぎの息子が急逝したから子供の中で一番成績のいい操りやすそうなあの子を引っ張ってくるとか、わかりやすいわよね、旦那様も。
あの愛人、息子の亡くなった当日に出てったみたいよ。
そりゃ居場所なくしちゃうわよね。
My body had begun to tremble. It was a part of the story I'd almost pushed out of my mind by now. That mistress and the boy she'd supposedly given birth to.
泣く？
I'd always thought it strange. Why had Dad called for me when he did? Why suddenly approach a daughter you tossed aside once before?
旦那様もやることが徹底してるわよね。更新所使ってまであの子の情報を仕入れてさ、さも自分がちゃんと見ていたかのような取り繕い方して。
I thought that attention was his way of atoning for my mother's suffering.
今まで全然興味すらなかったのにね。そういうふりしなきゃあの子に取り入れないから必死なのよ。
一種の洗脳プログラムよね、あれ。最初はぎこちなく接するふりして、その後確信をついて打ち解ける。
What?
専門家まで呼んで策を練ったそうね。
No, it's not all an act. What? I thought that was his attempt at finally becoming a father
そ
to
れ
me.
にあっさりと騙されるお
He
嬢
would not go
様。
that far, would he? Dude, no, I simply convinced myself it had to be that way. Deep down, I knew all along that it couldn't possibly have been true.
おい、やめないか。そろそろそのお嬢様の戻られる時間だ。
はいはい。
ちょっと前までどうでもいい存在だったのに、道具として利用価値が出た瞬間にこれだもの。すごい世界よね。
で、またどっかで男の子が生まれた瞬間、一気にお払い箱になると。
そっか、その手がまだあったか。
見てみたいわよね、その表変する瞬間。
おい、いい加減にしないか。
はいはい。
With that languid response, the group dispersed. Even long after the footsteps faded away, I stood there in silence, perfectly still. An idle question occurred to me. What sort of an expression do I have on my face right now? What sort of expression do people make at times like these? I felt oddly detached from reality, as though watching a movie projected before my eyes by some hidden camera. Eventually, I took one step, then another. I dragged myself up the stairs on legs that didn't feel like my own. They said it would be raining in the evening, but the afternoon was pleasant, well suited to a bit of light exercise. Therefore, I got out of the car halfway and walked the remaining kilometer or so home. There wasn't any real reason for that. There wasn't any reason at all. And so I could only curse God. I reached my room. It was far too quiet inside. I'd almost begun to forget how painful the absence of sound could be. I'd almost begun to find the silence comfortable.
よし、じゃあ美佐子が母さんが治ったら3人で遊園地に行くか。
なんでそんなことを平然と言えるの？
Scraps of notebook paper danced around me. Fragments of the word dad, fragments of the word happy, fragments of sentences highlighted in bright colors. Months and months of my life scattered through the air. The upper half of my painting was thick with dabs of blue and yellow paint. That was the first part to go. With a harsh rip, the cloth tore away from one of the screws holding it in place, and as the canvas curled in on itself, white paint fell to the ground like a dusting of snow. In the lightless room, white, blue, and yellow flew about. Shattered and torn, powerless and broken, they melted one by one into the darkness. Oh, what is she going to do? Unable to think, unable to act, I endured the night. The time came for me to wake up. Acting on pure reflexive habit, I stood up on unsteady feet and made my preparations. Pathetically enough, there was still a part of me holding on to hope. The house was no longer a refuge, but I'd begun to make a small place for myself at school. I could just make more friends, find people to talk to. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe that would be something.
飯田さん。
I caught a glimpse of the face I was looking for from the hallway. Iida-san might be willing. If I kept talking to her little by little, she might become my friend.
ですって。それで
Iida-san seemed to be talking to somebody. I peered in through the window. She was sitting at the very center of a group of girls. I just have to talk to her later, when she was alone.
榊さんって愛人の子なんだってお父様が。
The child of a mistress. Those were the same hateful words they printed in the magazine that changed everything.
まだちょっとあの子に優しくしておこうかと思うの。
え？どうしてそんなことするの？そんな子だったらなおさら無視しておけば。
だってそうしたらもっと興味深い話が聞けるかもしれないじゃない。どうやって榊の家に母親が取り入ったのかとか。それでね。
For some reason, I thought of fruit hanging from a tree. At first, it ripens and swells on the end of its branch, beautiful and tempting. But in time, its coloration grows impure and unattractive. Its point of connection to the tree begins to creak from the stream. One thread of fiber snaps, then another. The thin line holding it to life and nourishment grows thinner and thinner. And finally, this moment, I heard something fall. I entered the classroom. The girls who had been snickering about me until a moment before innocently looked away and moved on to another topic of conversation. A few moments after dropping my bag by my desk, I slowly began to walk in their direction. I felt every movement of my feet with a brilliant, eerie clarity. This might be what it's like to take the last few steps toward the summit of a high mountain. A climber has the thrill of achieving something, but in the determination, the clear-minded acceptance of fate, there might be something similar, or so I thought, a spectator to my own actions.
あら、榊さん、何のご用かしら？
Iida Kanako turned to face me with her usual placid smile. I had already decided what would happen next. Familiar feelings swelled inside me, the same as when I cut my hair, my diary, my canvas.
どうしたの、榊さん？お顔の色がよろしくないわ。先生に。
Iida Kanako's hand reached out to me. To my eyes, it looked like the grasping paw of a corpse pulling me down into hell. I'd understood all along. I'd simply kept myself from noticing. There was never any place of refuge here. I'd forced myself to believe in lies because I couldn't keep going without them. But I'd finally found another way to live. I watched serenely as the blood spurted out. For a moment, she couldn't even process what had happened. For just a moment, she stared down blankly at her hand, at her palm, dieting her. Iida Kanako collapsed in slow motion. Desks clattered all around, but others backed away as if distancing themselves from a live bomb.
榊さん、あなた、先生、誰か呼んできて、先生を。
What? That's right. I should have cut it all apart. I should have just shut off my brain and cut my way to freedom. I was grinding my teeth as hard as I could. There were tears streaming down my face. But all things considered, I didn't feel particularly sad. Much the opposite. Since the blade had finally severed me from the lies, I was filled with a strange sense of relief. It felt as though a wide, shining road forward had been revealed to me.
そうよね。こうなるのよね。
I shouldn't have hoped for a happy ending in the first place. Everything was scripted from the very start. And the actress had passively accepted her role, dreaming of a heartwarming conclusion to the black comedy that had been written for her. At some point, I'd begun to laugh. The tears were still rolling down my cheeks, but there was no sadness in me anymore. I'd left most of that behind on the day my mother broke, and the rest on the day my father betrayed me. I depleted my stock of sorrow. Just how much of a clown do I need to be? Just how pathetic do I need to become? What do I need to do to satisfy my cowering audience, to please the God who wrote this play? Their eyes watched me from what felt like an enormous distance, pushing me lower and lower into the dirt. I brandished the open box cutter in my right hand toward the back of the classroom. Incoherent little shrieks from my classmates were the only response. A few girls had already broken down in tears.
笑いなさいよ、あなたたち。いつも見てたんでしょ、滑稽だって。ほら、笑えばいいじゃないの。ねえ。
I laughed in their place, even when the teachers who came running pinned me down, even when they carried me out of the classroom like some sort of terrorist. Wouldn't it be odder not to laugh at something so utterly ridiculous? When they took me away, I noticed my desk standing isolated in the chaos and felt a twinge of pity at leaving it behind. Until the very end, I could never see the person who supposedly sat there. My father acted swiftly once he was notified. A settlement was reached with the Iida family. The incident was erased without so much as a disciplinary hearing. At first, my father tried to coax me out of my locked room with gentle words, but I refused to acknowledge his existence. After more than a month of that siege, I was half forced out, loaded unceremoniously into a car, and brought to a town where the air smelled of seawater. I understood what sort of a place it was the moment I saw the high walls surrounding it. It was a housing facility, a pleasant little cage where I could be safely stowed away without the risk of causing further trouble. A woman who introduced herself as the principal introduced me to the school with a slightly fearful expression on her face. She brought me to an empty dormitory and told me it would be my new home. When I checked the bank book I'd been handed on the way over, I found a rather excessive amount of pocket money in my account. From the day I began to wear an exceptionally flashy school uniform and commute to Miyahama Academy, I haven't been face to face with my father even once. What? Oh, jeez. A personality starts off as something like a cube. When we're young, we clumsily bump our corners against other people in the form of childish conflicts. Eventually, our sharp edges are worn away to leave something more like a sphere. She's so unfortunate. She has to be the child inside of this family. There's more or less what people are describing when they say that someone's soft. Modern collisions with others help us mature, but when those first impacts are too strong, they can have a different effect. Instead of losing our corners little by little, we splinter in strange, harsh ways, warping into crooked shapes. She's just this child in the middle of this family. It's so bad. Oh, once crooked, it's hard to become a sphere. Even as the people around them mellow, their sharpness only grows harsher, and everyone who approaches ends up getting hurt. But even the most warped human beings started off in the same shape as everyone else. Sometimes they look back on the past in grief. Sometimes they wonder if it's not too late to reshape themselves. And because they know that's an empty dream, they grieve once again. Sakaki Yumiko is one of many such sad, distorted objects. This is what she has to be in the middle of. Oh man, I feel bad. I feel very bad for her. The rain which I'd taken for a passing shower continued long after the thunder passed away. By the time we leave our cover in the lingering drizzle, the sun's already set. In a change from the usual routine, I hurry down the road home with an arm wrapped around Sakaki, who stumbles along unsteadily at my side. This is the life that she has to accept. Unfortunately. The rain's very weak by now, but the constant dampness has left her body noticeably chilled. And at the moment, her emotional state is a bit of a concern as well. I lean closely over Sakaki as we walk, sheltering her from the rain as best I can. That relatively brief journey back to the dorm feels awfully long right now.
あ、帰ってきた。どうしたの？ずいぶん遅かったじゃん。榊さんどうしたの？何か怪我とかしたとか？
Amani yelps in surprise the instant she lays eyes on us. Was it that much of a shock to see me holding Sakaki by the shoulder? Well, considering the girl's normal personality, I suppose it's only reasonable to jump straight to assuming something's physically wrong with her. How can I help this girl? She's in so bad of a situation with her life. We got caught in that downpour, that's all. We sheltered from the rain for a while.
それで雨に濡れちゃったのね。榊さん、大丈夫？ごめんなさい。心配をかけたわね。
Her physical condition aside, Sakaki seems badly drained in spirit. That uncharacteristic weakness from before is still plainly evident in her tone of voice.
体冷えたでしょ？何か温かいものでも飲む？用意するけど。ありがとう。それじゃあ、お言葉に甘えていただくわ。了解。4時は榊さんを部屋まで連れて行って、後で持っていくから。
Appreciate it.
いいわよ、これぐらい。それよりほら、早く。
I'm making a note. Once I'm old and gray, I'm going to write, Amani was like a mother to us all in my memoirs.
お礼のつもりだったら、吹き込むような表記はマジ勘弁して。
As soon as I got Sakaki to her room, she collapsed into her bed. Normally she would have ejected me to change out of her wet clothes, but she's currently lacking the energy and willpower to bother.
よほど疲れてたのね。もう寝ちゃったわよ、榊さん。
Yeah. The hot orange and honey drink Amani provided seemed to calm Sakaki down. It didn't take long at all for her to dawn off. I think she's got a slight fever as well. We were out in the rain and all.
みたいね。ちょっと暑いかな。
Lightly holding her hand to Sakaki's forehead, Amane nods in agreement. Sakaki doesn't seem to be in any real discomfort, but I can tell that she's breathing a little roughly. In any case, thanks for the help, Amane. I'm going to keep an eye on her for a little longer, but you can head back to your room. Amani's response seems oddly hesitant. What's wrong?
ねえ、ユージ。
Yes?
あのさ、分かってるとは思うけど、やっちゃダメだからね。
The heck?
だからさ、二人っきりじゃん？看病してるわけじゃない？そしたらなんかこう、ついでにしちゃったら大変だし、その、風邪うつっちゃったら大変かなって。
My face falls into my palm. For some reason, I find myself recalling a gag brain graph website Sachi showed me once. Just by entering someone's name, you get a brain-shaped pie chart breaking down the composition of their thoughts. I didn't think to try Amane at the time, but I think hers would be divided in half right down the middle. One side would be folksy grandma wisdom, the other, as should probably go without saying, would be branded with the word sex. You think I'm going to start making babies like a rabbit in the moment someone leaves me in a cage with a female? Does this scenario play out frequently inside that filthy mind of yours?
だから大事に至らないように釘刺しておこうっていうことよ。わかるでしょ、そういうの。
Okay. It's still not entirely clear to me what Amani is so worried about, but I find it extremely unpleasant to have such aspersions cast on my character. Well, it's not a bad idea, come to think of it.
何がよ。
I've heard that a slight fever can actually make for a more enjoyable experience in some respects.
え？
Alright then, might as well put that to the test. It's not like you can catch a fever intentionally, and I'll admit I'm curious. I'm sure Sakaki will understand. A little experimentation like this can only enrich your life, right? She might end up thanking me for expanding her horizons. This dialogue is nuts sometimes. The thought hadn't even occurred to me. But thanks to a tip from my sexually savvy friend Amane, a new world of possibility awaits. Life is always overflowing with chances to explore the wonders of the unknown. I'm deeply impressed by your ability to keep that in mind even at a time like this. Thank you, Amane. It's like... Amane, she's the one that brought it up. Amane stares back at me with the blank eyes of a broken electronic toy. Smiling brightly, I give her a friendly thump on the shoulder. It was a joke.
当たり前じゃ、コンボケ。
Mane's karate chop lands a critical hit smack in the middle of my weary head. From outside, an owl hoots in mournful commiseration.
じゃあ、私そろそろ戻るけどさ。本当にダメだからね。そっとしとかないと。
I said I understand, didn't I? Come on, get lost already.
信用ならね。
Mane backs slowly out of the room, staring at me reproachfully all the way. I was only teasing her a little in retaliation for slandering me, but it seems I've ended up deepening her unfounded suspicions. Probably best to consider the possibility she might try some half-done wiretapping outside the door. I can't believe Yuji can tolerate all of this sometimes. Shaking my head, I return to Sakaki's side. Her breath's coming regularly, a little more quietly than before. She doesn't seem to have noticed the commotion in the slightest. Well, that's definitely for the best. Borrowing the chair from Sakaki's desk, I ease myself down and look her over at closer range. Come to think of it, this is the first time I've seen her sleeping. The girl really does have a pretty face. She's constantly forcing it into a scowl, so it's easy not to notice at times. But Sakaki Yumiko is definitely what you call a beauty. Right now, that face is relaxed, her eyes shut, her cheeks slightly flushed. Sakaki looks very calm and peaceful at the moment, but much of her life has been an emotional roller coaster of loneliness, hope, and anger. Now that I know the whole story, her usual prickly attitude is all too understandable. Rest easy, alright, I'll protect you. I lightly reach down to put my hand on her forehead, currently covered in a damp towel. The moisture against my palm is slightly warm from the heat of her fever.